This week, Jewish community takes a lot of work. You need money, motivation, and perhaps most of all, you need the people to run events and engage other Jews. But Jewish professionals are not having a great time right now dealing with burnout, equity, and leadership issues. So I take a deep dive on this with consultant Angie Lieber. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. This episode is sponsored by JewFolk Inc., which is hosting its first in-person fundraising event, FolkFest, on October 30th at Minnesota Hillel. From music and art to food and fun, FolkFest 22 will be a celebration for you. In order to celebrate 10,000 Ways to be Jewish, FolkFest will have an array of activities, including fun for the family, hands-on crafts, Israeli whiskey tasting, and interesting speakers. The festival will culminate with a special acoustic solo concert from Minnesota's own Jewish rock star Peter Himmelman. For more information and to buy your tickets, go to tcjewfolk.com/folkfest. The link is also in the podcast notes. If you want to subscribe to our weekly TC JewFolk newsletter for all the local Minnesota Jewish news, or our new monthly podcast newsletter where you can get updates on all our podcasts, or our soon-to-fully launch newsletter for Cincinnati Jewish news, go to tcjewfolk.com and hit that subscribe button at the top of the screen. We also recently updated our food podcast, now called Not Your Bubby's Nosh, so go check that out. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 247 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. By the way, an update on last episode about Kanye West, anti-Semitism online, and internet policy. Billionaire trash talker Elon Musk has indeed bought Twitter and already fired some of the top executives responsible for managing moderation on the platform. Leaks also imply Musk is going to fire 3/4 of Twitter's staff, so Twitter is likely to get much worse for Jews, just as I talked about, as content moderation goes out the window and anti-Semitism is allowed, either purposefully or through incompetence, to really take over. I'm poking around some Twitter alternatives for fun, though I'm not planning to leave the platform myself anytime soon. This is somewhat of an opportunity, I think, to see if Jewish online communities can find a better platform to be on. But that's a story and maybe a podcast for another time. I'm hoping and expecting the Forward or JTA to cover what comes next. Okay. On to the actual story for this episode. Angie Lieber, a Jewish nonprofit professional and fundraising consultant, emailed JewFolk months ago to say hello and pitch an episode on Jewish professionals. She also mentioned having recently done an informal study of Jewish professionals at smaller nonprofits with some really not positive feedback about what they've been going through. So I interviewed her about it. We chatted around the time of the high holidays, by the way, so you'll hear reference to that. Now, I think it's important to really say why I wanted to do this episode. Jewish professionals and the wonkish insider talk of the nonprofit world can be kind of a turnoff as a conversation topic. In part, for some people, it's just not interesting. And for others, I think there's a sense, especially for those of us who have been or are Jewish professionals, we're sort of tired of talking about it when we already have to live it, you know? Also, for a variety of reasons, most Jews are not excited by, Jewish affiliation or institutions and prefer general non-denominational events and engagement opportunities. So they don't necessarily want to sit around and feel bad for the person inviting them to the 50th Facebook event to a synagogue that they'll probably still ignore. But here's the thing. Everything in the Jewish community, and this might sound obvious, from Jewish classes to young adult networking to child care to volunteering opportunities, everything happens because there are Jewish professionals putting those things together. And this isn't just about engagement or networking. This is also about the Jewish organizations advocating for Jewish causes politically, responding to anti-Semitism. All of these things require dedicated professionals. And these professionals are not doing well. They are underpaid, under-resourced, often women dealing with sexism from an executive class at most Jewish organizations that is still overwhelmingly male. They're also struggling to do their jobs because donors are often chasing new programs and new initiatives and don't like to see their dollars go to sort of consistent old programs or even just overhead for organizations. Overhead, by the way, often just means pay for staff. So Jewish professionals are chasing a lot of different ideas in very small time frames with not necessarily all that much money or a guarantee that someone has thought through whether these ideas are actually what the community needs. And this is the backbone of how the Jewish community works. And we need to talk about it, be aware of it, and push for change to better support the professionals that make our stuff happen, because it will mean better community for all of us. So Lieber and I talked through all this stuff, and you're going to hear some personal reflections and experiences from me around some of these issues too, which honestly felt kind of nice to unpack. And in the podcast notes, if you want to learn more about gender equity and pay problems, are several links to organizations working on those issues in the Jewish nonprofit world, and also Lieber's website, if you'd like to learn more about her. I hope you find this conversation as interesting, relevant, and important as I do. Our conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. Before getting to your research study on Jewish professionals and the Jewish nonprofit work culture, I would love to ask a little bit about you. Could you tell the listeners what your Jewish professional background is and how you became a nonprofit consultant and coach?
Sure. I was in marketing and PR for many years in the Jewish communal world. And then I moved into fundraising for 10 years. I was at a Jewish day school. Then I became a consultant after I did some time in the secular world. And I've moved into coaching predominantly because I've realized how fundraising is really about the people that are that are working for the nonprofits, and so helping the people be more involved in their own leadership and their own growth, and how to make the organization stronger can lend itself to better advancement.
And just out of curiosity, what are some of maybe the big trends that you've noticed, or changes or lack of changes in the Jewish professional world that you've seen over your time? Because I believe you started at the Manhattan JCC back in the mid-2000s, right? That's quite a place to sort of observe the Jewish world.
Right. I was at the JCC in Manhattan, which is now the Marlene Meyerson JCC. And I was the PR director there. And that organization has grown exponentially because of the clientele on the Upper West Side. I would say that the biggest shift is the post-pandemic shift, which is the how to move to remote hybrid teams. How are we able to grow as an organization when everyone is in different places? And that requires a real commitment to organizational and cultural shifts that I'm not sure the Jewish nonprofit sector has actually been able to keep up with. And
so, coming to this research study that you did about Jewish professionals, why did you decide to do this qualitative study? What sort of aspects did you focus on that you were trying to sort of learn more about, and how did you go about collecting data? Sort of talk the background of the study itself.
Yeah, I held many conversations with Jewish nonprofit professionals, and I came to the study because I wanted to learn more about what the pain spots were for coaching needs. And in it, I found that there was really this incredible demand on nonprofit workers to, I think mostly in the Jewish communal world. I don't know if it extends to the secular world because I've been focused in the Jewish communal world, but I imagine that in nonprofits in general, the expectation is that you are fully committed to the mission, that it is your faith, right? And if we are working in the Jewish communal world as Jews, we need to be fully committed to it. And that means there are very little boundaries on work time, life-work balance, because we're giving our heart and soul to it. So that was a really big standout. The other standout is that all the work that's being done in the corporate sector on teams and team management and leadership and vulnerability and how to have teams and be leaders in a way that's about listening. How to really engage your colleagues and your staff in a way that's really about making them feel trusted hasn't really filtered down, at least in the small nonprofits that I've been in communication with, the workers that I've been in communication with. There is this sense of lack of trust that extends also in terms of partnerships in the Jewish communal world. So how are we actually communicating with each other in different nonprofits? What are we sharing? Is Judaism a zero-sum game? Can there be much more partnership, much more collaboration so that we're all in this together? Another thing that I really know is that generally how donors are driving a commitment to programs, right? Creation of programs, new programs that will keep the Jewish world and the Jewish future alive. But what would happen if we stopped really focusing on programs and we started to focus on the human resources that are leading these programs and provided leadership, guidance and coaching to our executives and our managers that are in the nonprofit sector? Wouldn't that bolster the programming that already exists?
And just to sort of back up and sort of take a kind of piece by piece, would love for you to elaborate a little bit more on sort of the personal aspect and being sort of sucked into the mission of Jewish nonprofit work and what that means for professionals. I think right now is sort of especially an interesting time to talk that with the high holidays and how sort of that consumes everybody from, synagogue staff to, even just sort of the rest of us nonprofit Jewish professionals trying to figure out sort of how to navigate the calendar, what comes next, what are we doing? So what are you sort of seeing in terms of that mission and the tug of war between Jewish professionals trying to better themselves, both as professionals and individuals, and then trying to sort of keep a lot of these organizations afloat through their work?
I mean, I don't think there is a lot of work that's being done on bettering themselves as professionals. I don't think it's being provided. I don't know if there's a much funding in it. Look, I have to be fully, qualify this with saying that I don't have a lot of conversations with people on the top federation levels. I do know that there are coaching efforts that are geared towards the executives, but not that much geared towards the managers. So how, as a manager, do you grow? How can you grow into a better manager or into being a better leader? What's happening with teams? What are we doing with teams? How are we functioning as nonprofits that have advancement offices and can really work collegially with each other and learning the best ways to be a great team? I really do think, and yes, you're right, with the holidays, everyone is working so hard, especially people that are on the religious, in the synagogues and that provide high holiday programming. They are working so hard. And where is there time for them to reflect on where they are spiritually themselves, where they are not only just giving, but where their team is, where the organization is spiritually, especially around this time of year? I don't know if that work is being done.
Yeah, that feels the one of, if not maybe the most important kind of structure question about Jewish nonprofits in the Jewish world, I think, because even this is sort of a very small scale example, but even working in a Jewish summer camp and doing music and helping to run services, the most stressful part of the week was always Shabbat. And there was never, for those of us trying to actually sort of get an entire camp of 500 plus people in the mood for a religious and spiritual experience, we never got time for ourselves to be able to get ourselves in that mood to then be able to help everyone else. So there's this constant tug of war, or snake eating its own tail kind of phenomena of what professionals are tasked with doing and how much they can bring themselves into that work, in the time that they have.
Well, I would ask you, Lev, what would you see might be things that could have shifted that for you? Had a better Shabbat experience for yourself while you're providing it for 500 campers.
In some sense, intentionality. We were so exhausted by the end of it, we never said, okay, maybe we'll do our own kiddush sort of to the side of things once we're done. There was never, but at the same time, that can also be tiring, because the moment we're done, then you go to dinner, then you have to take care of dinner things, then there's what's after dinner. So the rolling schedule never really allowed a lot of time for it. And when sort of combine that with the staffing crunch that, camps are facing, the broader sort of Jewish nonprofit world is facing as well, it's really I'm not sort of deeply in it in a way that I can answer anything, fundamental about it, but I really don't see a way out when everything kind of seems stacked against, there's only 7 days in a week. There's only 24 hours in a day. So I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love the intentionality. I have to say that if we paused and we had more intention, and we weren't rushing. One of the things that I've also noticed so much is how urgency is part of the Jewish communal discourse, right? It's just we got to get it done, without pausing, without reflecting, without necessarily building cultures that are not about urgency, but are about kindness and maybe employee-centered, and realizing that your employees are your Jewish future. How do we really get to that place that we understand that those people that have committed themselves to the Jewish communal world need to be cultivated as really strong purveyors of the Jewish future. We're just so focused on the programming and the urgency of that. So that's one thing that I've really noticed in all my conversations is the urgency. The other thing is mentorship. We don't have any conversations about mentoring. I haven't seen or heard about, there's lots of Jewish communal organizations that have no evaluations. There's no benchmarks, and there's no regrouping and invest in seeing what we've done and how did we get there and what were the deltas and what are the changes we need to make. These are all things that are really important parts of building an efficient business. All the people I spoke with said that that's not built in to their culture.
I also want to ask, sort of on that note, what were some of maybe the gender dynamics that came up during your conversations? Because it feels on the mentorship note, there's sort of a long-standing, this is sort of true of broader society, but, I think also true in the Jewish world, very much, just to put it bluntly for listeners, a men's club. There's a lot of, there have been several studies over the past couple of years and several sort of movements to showcase how few women and Jews of color there are in executive positions at a lot of organizations, especially some of the largest and most influential Jewish organizations. And it really sort of gets me wondering, at least, of when we're talking about mentorship, it seems like the guys always sort of buddy up and bro together, and that's part of what gets a lot of, and when you talk to these guys, that's always kind of the stories they tell of like, oh, got in there and he talked to me and we went out for beers and like it goes. But it seems like that avenue is not available for a lot of other people who frankly should be in leadership roles. So what, coming back to the question, what are the gender dynamics you've sort of noticed throughout your conversations on this?
I spoke entirely with women because I spoke with women managers. So my whole study is gender biased towards women. I think that we're talking about the Jewish world, and one of the main issues is a fear of change, right? I mean, as Jews, we're so frightened about what shifts could happen. And, the joke about the grandmother that says that one of her grandchildren is so un-Jewish she's irresponsible, and the other is so Jewish she's a fanatic. Like there's this fear of what is my Judaism, and so as Jews of color are moving into leadership positions, as Judaism in America is shifting, as language of our relationship to Israel is shifting. This is all really scary. And so we're holding on to this is what I believe, we're holding on to what we know. And I think that male leadership is something that everyone feels, okay, secure with. The other thing is how we move away from women who are in leadership of positions just appropriating what they know of leadership being that of patriarchy, right? The one that the more authoritarian leadership, the one that's they're frightened about being perceived of as soft, as being perceived as collaborative, of being perceived of as. So we have to be able to embrace these changes and not be so scared that it is going to change, the future of Judaism forever. And I do think that one of the most important leadership realities is for men who are leaders to embrace a more collaborative model. For men who are leaders to embrace their own vulnerabilities, to be transparent about where they are with their weaknesses and their strengths, to build teams that, and I keep on going back to that, but that reflect their weaknesses. So what do? You get people who you trust who can do those things that you're not so great at, and to invest in that team. That can lend itself to great success. I think that many, many more women are being hired, and so what do we have there? We have a real fear of the feminization of the entire Jewish communal world. And what happens there? Salaries get lowered. It becomes a place that's not competitive. I know lots of people, Sarah Plevin-Shapiro, who's really working on the Gender Equity Project, the Gender Equity and Hiring Project, who are at the front lines of ensuring that doesn't happen.
And just for listeners, so bringing some of the sort of experience from Jewfolk and sort of some of the journalism conversations I'm also having at sort of the intersection of both the Jewish world and journalism. First of all, it's really interesting you brought up the sort of, marginalized communities coming into a position of power, but then sort of taking on the same negative power roles that existed before, because that's in the journalism world is a huge, huge issue of sort of outfits that say they're, for gender equity and then still, very much mistreat writers and pay poorly and all that kind of thing. So it's a sort of just interesting to hear that brought up again. But also, one of the things I know Jewfolk has been very, what we've been emphasizing, because we also run sort of a jobs board where Jewish organizations can post on TC Jewfolk to, for job positions. And we make sure to say you have to post the salary range, you have to say who this position is reporting to, like more of that transparency to hopefully lead then to more equitable hiring practices and pay, which I know has also been a big focus in the Jewish world when it comes to sort of, like the issues you mentioned of pays going down and, because a lot of women are getting hired and the inequities that come about.
And I also want to say that part of this change is also in the world of gender identity, that it's super scary for people of a certain age who might be leaders of bigger Jewish, communal nonprofits to say, to recognize that gender of the population. I mean, my daughter's 16. Gender is not really a thing anymore for her. It's not a thing. So that's like a huge thing for Judaism, right? Because gender is such a part of our entire religion. So much of our religion is based on whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. So what do we do with that? And how, as nonprofit leaders, do we start to say, okay, how am I going to make sense of the populations that I serve, that it might be on the continuum of conservative and liberal of the constituency, but also understand that equitably with my hiring, I need to recognize that that people are on a really wide continuum of gender.
To pivot a little bit now, I want to ask about something that a larger dynamic that you mentioned before, this sort of Jewish professional funder relationship, which is also kind of a sore point for a lot of what projects happen, who gets hired, how much they get paid. Something you mentioned in your original email to JewFolk actually was this idea of and this will sound kind of harsh to listeners, but like we'll walk through it. Funders as puppeteers is, I think, the quote you used. So I want to ask you to explain more about that, because especially as funding power has sort of shifted from central communal funders like federations, to individual donors and foundations, there's been a wide-ranging conversation about how donor priorities don't always align with the actual sort of Jewish communal priorities, but if the money talks, the money talks. So, how's the navigation happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I want to start off by saying that the Jewish communal world is blessed with incredibly generous and forgiving donors. There are funders that have given so much money, so much of themselves, and have not made demands back. I'm always floored as a fundraising professional when I see that kind of leadership. So I want to start there, but also acknowledge that donors aren't always aware of what it means to invest in employees and the people. And I understand, because we're so scared to maintain the Jewish future, and we want to attract as many people as possible, and to keep the market close to us, that we want to provide more creative programming. And yet, there's a lot of study just came out about how donors don't want to invest in organizations that have high overhead, which we understand, but low overhead to please a donor, right? And sort of makes organizations in this, what's called, a starvation cycle. You're always searching and working for more funding, because particularly that you haven't equipped yourself with a very strong employee base, because you don't have competitive salaries, you don't have the benefits that you need, you don't have the support and the coaching that managers and leaders need. Therein lies a little bit of a conflict and a conversation with donors The quote that I gave you about puppeteers was not my language. It was a quote that came from the survey that I did. I think that employees feel that they are sort of having to march to whatever the new donor wants them to do. The donors that are really committed to this solidity of the work of the nonprofit tend to not be the ones that are making demands about programming. Another thing that, I just want to speak to is what happens when organizations don't invest in overhead is that donors become volunteers and they become the people that are working in some capacity for the organization. And then you're really reliant on a volunteer for expertise. And that's for small organizations. That is something that you would hope would be for future would be something that they would grow out of, a donor-based, volunteer-driven model. So that's where that puppeteer language came from.
And just to sort of hit what seems to be sort of the center of controversy a lot of the times around this sort of trend is Israel. And, how much did Israel sort of come up in the conversations you were having? Also, just to sort of give a sense of current events to listeners, I believe it was Jewish Currents that just recently dropped a pretty interesting story. I haven't read it yet, actually, but it's about how Jewish funders and Jewish studies professors are sort of clashing over Israel. There's a very prominent case, I believe, in Seattle, University of Washington. I don't remember exactly where, of a Jewish studies professor getting a lot of money pulled by a funder because they didn't like what was being taught around sort of Israel and Palestine and sort of whatever the education was happening there. So that, what conflicts are you hearing about that at sort of a small scale level at these nonprofits?
I think it's different depending upon the work of the nonprofit. I think that if you're a JCC, you can stand with Israel, and there are going to be people who are on the other side of it, but politics isn't always a part of the conversation. Also with arts and culture, you can stand with Israel, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it feels okay. And it's not a conversation that needs to be, if you do other kind of work, or if you're a synagogue that makes it so that everybody has to buy into a certain action with Israel, that's another issue. I think that one of the hardest thing is going to be in the Jewish future, near Jewish American future, is how to manage our communal feelings about anti-Zionism. What happens with that group of people? Are they integrated into our common discourse, or are they going to create a different model of Jewish life moving forward? I would hope that people who are not Zionists are still a part of our Jewish community, our entire Jewish communal experience. I think that existed before in the early 40s, when there were tons of people, and from socialists to ultra-Orthodox religious, who weren't Zionists, and they were still considered Jews. So that's something that we're going to have to work through. In the nonprofit world, it really does depend upon the actions that the nonprofit takes.
I also want to sort of zoom out for a moment for listeners and sort of clearly draw the stakes here, because we're talking sort of a little bit wonkish. I think a lot of Jews, by virtue of being in the Jewish community, either think they understand the work of Jewish professionals or think they understand how, the community operates. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes it's not so much the case. So, can you just sort of explain, why does it matter how Jewish professionals are faring right now with these issues and with sort of the Jewish nonprofit culture that we've spoken about?
how organizations function is important for our society, whether they're Jewish or not, right? There's if you are a nonprofit that has a history of toxicity from the top down, people aren't going to want to give to that organization, and that organization will fail. We need to prevail. And in order to prevail, it's important that the people that are working in the Jewish communal world are listened to and are supported. I think that in itself is important. Now, I think that philanthropy is an arm of our economy, a very essential arm of the American economy. So how donors are investing in their nonprofits and how they are committing to the employees and the leadership that are working in these nonprofits is an important part of the larger economic conversation of America, in my opinion.
And that kind of leads me to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is to talk a little bit more about, solutions. You've got this study, you've got these results of these conversations. We've talked a little bit about sort of the general approaches that sort of need to be changed to manifest some of the changes that Jewish professionals need. But what, to get a little bit more specific, if possible, what comes next or what needs to come next in the Jewish community? And the added layer of that is what can, the rest of us who are maybe not Jewish professionals do to help with the situation?
Yeah, I know there are lots of federations. I know the Jewish Federation of North America is investing in consulting that will help nonprofits, mostly, federations, their leadership grow. I laugh only because when I was in a direct fundraiser, there were always board members that said, let's figure out how to replicate the corporate model. And I felt like, hey, this is a nonprofit, it's not a corporation. In terms of economics, we might not be able to replicate what you know. But can we replicate what's happening in the corporate world in terms of supporting managers and supporting leaders and providing relevant professional development, investing in not just training, but actual professional development, investing in mentorship, investing in ways that we can have more clear structures in place, infrastructure in place, whether it's just relationships, evaluations, I mentioned mentorship. That might mean holding back on programming for a little bit. That might mean saying, okay, the people are first right now, and these workers are first right now, and they are doing the job of ensuring that there's a very strong Jewish future. And so we need to invest in them. That's what I think needs. It might mean raising overhead a little bit.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share. And hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.